Welcome to this Euranet Plus debate presented within the Citizens Corner concept. The debate is produced and hosted by Euranet Plus and Skaï Greece, a member of the Euranet Plus network. The debate can be followed live in the European Parliament on our Euranet Plus Inside website, on our Facebook profile as well as on Twitter using the hashtag Citizens Corner. I'm Brian Maguire. Joining us today to discuss the fight against corruption in Europe, Kati PIRI is Social Democrat member of the European Parliament from the Netherlands, Giovanni Kessler, Director General of the European Anti-Fraud Office, OLAF, Carl Dolan, Director of Transparency International European Union Liaison Office, Eva Kelly from the group of the Alliance of Social Democrats in the European Parliament, and Georgios KATROUGKALOS, MEP from the United Left as well. Welcome to all of you. Carl Dolan, let's kick off with you. We have any corruption in Europe?
There's plenty of corruption in Europe. You only have to look at the results of our Corruption Perceptions Index, the latest edition, which will be published tomorrow, so a little too late for the show, I'm sad to say. But and it varies. It varies across Europe, but you can see that there is very persistent levels of corruption.
What are the problems? What are the key issues?
Well, I would say we did a study of this a number of years ago, and the key issue in a nutshell is the unregulated links between the business sector and politicians. And then there's a couple of key issues around there which are to do with political party financing, loopholes in political party financing laws, or to do with the way that the conflicts of interest that politicians have with the business sector are unregulated.
Okay, Georgios, you see both sides of this argument. You're regulating and you're involved in political parties as well. How do you perceive corruption in Europe? Is it getting better or getting worse?
Well, it depends. First of all, we must differentiate it between, let's say, petty corruption, one that a small public servant can do in his framework, and let's say mega corruption, one that can do if one is a head of a government or representing a multinational company. First of all, as already said, the first thing is to have transparency in everything. But even if we have transparency, there are sometimes that the links between those that are governing the political system and those that are governing the economic are so obscure that one cannot be sure whether something is legal, and even if it is legal, if it is moral and in the interests of the European people. I'm referring now clearly to the LuxLeaks, this treaties between a government of the European Union and multinationals, allowing to the latter to give taxes to the amount of 4%. It's clearly that something like that, even if it is not corruption at the legal definition of the term, it's clearly immoral and against both of the interests of the social state in Europe and of the citizens.
Okay, Eva, do you see corruption increasing or decreasing?
Well, I think it's increasing at some sectors and decreasing at some others. If we would use new technologies to handle all the if you know, contracts between EU, the institutions, because the one problem is that here we don't see what happens in the EU institutions. So this is a big thing, because when we're talking about corruption, we're talking especially with EU, with institutions, with the public sector. So we lack and we miss a big part of this research. Also, the problem is that it's not just it's not that regulations that should be strict. You should follow where the money go all the way. So the transparency stays at the first level. It should go and see what the results of the money, where the money went. So this is a big problem. And also, if you see the European Commission's results, they say that people do not trust the politicians. They are the least ones that they trust. They trust police, justice, and NGOs, and last but not least, the politicians. So I think we should start working a little bit better with our own issues, the institutions.
Kati, do you think this issue with politicians is simply because, while there's some corruption clearly, that they are so high profile that it's easy to identify, and that perhaps the iceberg is just much deeper below the political level?
Well, I think in general, corruption erodes the trust of citizens in democracy. So obviously, if there is corruption also at the political level, it also erodes the trust that people have in politicians. You see this not only in the European Union, you see this actually around the world. And I would even say it's not just about it would be we would make the problem too small by only focusing on the corruption with EU financial interests or EU money. This is a much bigger problem than that, and obviously politicians are the ones making the laws, and are also the ones which are to be held accountable. So we have a special role when it comes to the attack of this problem.
Okay, Giovanni Kessa used to deal with the mafia. What was it like living in Brussels and dealing with this crew?
It's a different issue. We should avoid confusing things or mixing up things of moral nature, of mafia, corruption, which are otherwise we run the risk to find the wrong solution or not to find any solution possible. So we have to focus it. Corruption is an illegal act which is used by dishonest persons, not only by politicians, actually, by entrepreneurs, by public officials, and also by people in the mafia as a tool in order to obtain something they do not have the right to do. So actually mafia uses corruption when they are weak, when they are powerless, actually. Otherwise they have other more convincing tools to get what they want or to earn illicit money, actually, which are the weapons. But where they cannot use their intimidation power, they use corruption. So anyway, here the corruption, as it has been said already, it is an issue. It is an issue at the top of the political agenda as well. So anti-corruption is today an issue, I think, in most of the member states. It's at the top of the political agenda, and also in the EU institution is at the top of the attention and of the awareness. I think this is already a positive point, actually. The worst thing is when we have corruption, but it is not perceived by the people and by the institutions. At least we are not at this stage. We are at a stage in most of the member states and in the EU institutions where the issue of corruption is recognized as a serious problem.
Do you think, Giovanni, this is in part because so many leaders, prime ministers in particular, have been exposed to corruption scandals, including prosecution and imprisonment in Europe?
No.
You can draw a line from Portugal all the way across the continent, a straight line.
We are aware of what has happened recently, the allegations in Portugal, not only. But I think it's not only because of this. Of course, one of these cases has a much bigger impact than many other cases. I think it's also one of the reasons of this high awareness of today is also the economic crisis that people are living, which makes any leniency, or at least perceived leniency towards the corruption as totally unacceptable.
Okay. Is the Transparency International, in those new websites, it's a very neat definition of corruption. It says, corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. It hurts everyone who depends on the integrity of people in a position of authority. Eva, how do you convince people to trust politicians again, and how do we deal with this, the corruption which is so visible?
Well, I have to give you like one example. In Greece, for example, if something needs to be legal from a political decision, it has to be online. So it has to go through the internet. Everybody has access to it. So first thing is that. Second, it's a tool, new technologies. The second, I'm the rapporteur of the annual taxation report here in the European Parliament. So this report is on the table for 10 years. It has the tools that need to be implemented to its member state to fight corruption, to fight tax evasion, tax avoidance, and to handle issues like LuxLeaks. So we have to convince, and the momentum with the LuxLeaks perhaps gives us this opportunity, we have to convince the member states to apply and accept to apply the basic tools of taxation in order to fight tax avoidance and tax evasion. So I think this is one big step. For me, there are not magical solutions. So if we show that we accept to change our system, I think people will gain trust back to the political system.
Kati, LuxLeaks, is it possible to deal with corruption across Europe when we have a perception at the head of the European Commission that there was wrongdoing, albeit morally and not legally?
Well, I think we all have, first of all, a role to play in that if we don't give the good example, how can we ask others to follow? So that, as a general remark, I think is always valid. When it comes to getting back that trust for politicians, we must make sure there is no impunity, that when there have been wrongdoings, you see that the rule of law, the system is working, and people are being brought to the court.
Bring in one of our students now, Clara Soteres from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Clara, have you got a question?
Yes, good morning. I would like to introduce some data. In this February, the European Union made an inform which contained 4 recommendations to control the corruption in the national governments. So my question is, how can we put these politics in practice?
Carl.
Well, I do agree that the lack of progress that has been made on fighting corruption in the EU and more broadly has been because of lack of political will, and so that we know that there are problems in the system, lack of resources for police and judiciary. We know there are problems in terms of bringing cases to trial and finding convictions. But these things can be solved. So there needs to be those kind of that political will there.
Okay, Georgios got to go. So, Georgios, what do we need to do to improve the situation now?
I think there is a silver bullet, and it has been discovered by the United States at the turn of the last century. They had a huge problem of black money. It was the era of the robber barons. A lot of money from railways, from oil, and what they have done, they have introduced at the level of state constitutions, first in Oregon, then in California, the recall of the elected representatives. Schwarzenegger has been elected in California after such a referendum that has recalled the former governor Davis. So the silver bullet is direct participation of the citizen, accountability that does not go just to some obscure mechanisms, but goes down to the citizen themselves. And by that, I must excuse myself.
Thank you
very
for
sorry
your
because
contribution.
I have a committee.
Okay.
Thank you.
Giovanni, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, we need a comprehensive strategy, which has necessarily to encompass 3 dimensions. The prevention of the corruption, which is the most important and sometimes most forgotten part of the strategy. The detection of possible corruption. I'm more worried about the non-detected corruption. We always speak about the detected one. But I think the most worrying and dangerous is the non-detected one, which I think is the biggest part of it. Thirdly, we need to have good tools of reaction, which means prosecution, which means criminal law, so the enforcement actually. All these 3 dimensions have to be addressed. And in a nutshell, at the European Union level, we are still at the very beginning of it, because all this has, till the Lisbon Treaty, not been part of the European Union. That is, it has been treated member states by member state, which is obsolete and outdated strategy. And we are doing the first steps at the European level, but we have to do much more in a coordinated, harmonized European way.
Okay, Eva, the transparency that you speak about seems perfectly achievable in this digital age as well, and yet we have the Court of Auditors returning a budget declaration year after year, which is, it's unfathomable that we continue to do this in this day and age.
Well, with Barroso, the truth is that we had lack of progress to any level. So I do believe that with Juncker committing that committed until 2016, he will give and present results. So the need of people and the crisis that we faced as EU will make us work towards that direction. So I do believe that with the globalization, and since everything is beyond borders now, it seems that we need more Europe. So we try to strengthen the more Europe that we need, even in regulations and law, and to try to prevent this corruption that reaches a level of 120 billion, which is huge. So I do think, since we have accepted that and we're trying to work to keep EU and make it more political, we already made some progress. And let me tell you, I think these 5 years of Juncker will be critical for the existence and the future of EU and the form that it will continue. If it will be a divided, 2 different, how do you say that? I'm sorry.
2 speeds.
2 speeds, yeah, exactly. I think it will solve this issue once and for all. Either we'll move forward, all of us, or it will stop being formed as we know it. So I think the need and the crisis will make us solve all these issues.
Okay, Kati, just before you respond, do you think that the crisis made corruption more likely or less likely?
Well, difficult to say, but for certain it makes people even more angry when they see it's happening. I think that's why we are also talking about it at such a level. I fully agree with the previous speakers, but I would like to add that if we don't make national institutions stronger for having the prevention, detection, and then also for bringing it to court, we will not be able to solve this issue from here, from the EU institutions. So I think these two things should go hand in hand. In the end, we also need very strong national institutions dealing with the fight of corruption. In the end, it's people, when they go to hospital and there's still this envelope culture, which angers them a lot, which has nothing to do so much with EU finances, but it's still the perception that this is still a general thing that is ongoing within the European Union that erodes the trust of the people.
Okay, we have a question on Facebook. We'll come back to you in just a moment, David. Giorgio Panassi, he asks how to fight European corruption against mafia, which have no borders without a European police force. Let's put this to Giovanni first, then we'll come to Eva. I've done a story recently about the Amber Alert and how to deal with abducted children across Europe. And Sophie Interveld, she said very clearly, you know, criminals don't respect borders. How do we deal with corruption across Europe?
It's a very correct, to the point issue. Actually, we also tend still to continue to speak about country by country, which country is most corrupt and so on. But more and more, it's what we see from Olaf's point of view, these kind of crimes, also the corruption, especially the important corruption, is by nature transnational. So it's difficult to attribute it only to a country, even when one prime minister of a country is corrupted, but the corruption happens in another country because the money is paid in a third country. Because, as said, money does not have any border, goods have no borders, persons within Europe don't have any border, justice has borders, police has borders, judges and prosecutors have borders. So the answer is already on the table, is the proposal that the Commission did last year, actually, to set up an European public prosecutor office, which sees some resistances in member states, and in a culture which is, let's say, an old culture and not up-to-state culture, which is used to consider the issue of justice, of law enforcement as purely national. But by a purely national approach, we will lose the battle of prevention and especially of detection and of prosecuting corruption. So we need more Europe into it, and the European Public Prosecutor Office will be the first change.
Eva, do you support the idea of a prosecutor's office, and how do you think we move this forward when the bill's been on the table for 10 years?
Well, I think, as I told you, that since there are no borders, everything is beyond borders. Ebola, a crisis on the health sector, so that there are no borders. Everything will finally reach our door. So I do believe that we have to start taking decisions with a majority and not unanimously, if that's needed. And the question you raised like a few minutes ago, if things got worse, 20% of the richer people became even richer during the crisis. So this means we have a problem, and the poor became poorer. So we have to create more indicators, not only economic, but social indicators too, to see where we should go. And as I told you, the only thing we can do is start planning in a different way and be more effective. And I do think that we decided that the EU has to change, and Juncker has committed to that. So trust me, I think it's going to be better than Barroso.
I'll try to trust you. Okay, we have another one of our students with us now as well, Roger Torres from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Roger, you have a question for our panel.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I'd like to talk now about the perception some citizens have of corruption within the system itself. You've talked before about the problems of the system, but now about the corruption. Is there any idea on how to rethink or to rework the system in order to make corruption distasteful for the perpetrators, not only for the victims, which is the society in general?
Carl.
Well, the best way to make corruption distasteful for the perpetrators is effective punishment and sanctioning, and to make the criminal justice system work. And that's not that's a particular issue, I think, in the case of corporate crime, because we know that large fines for companies don't deter. They're seen as parking fines in some instances. The one thing that really does scare people is the possibility of going to jail. And so I think, particularly in the area of white-collar crime, when we're dealing with, say, companies or banks or service providers dealing with dirty money, which is a big issue, and I agree with the former panelists that if we take a global perspective, the issue with Europe is not just the corruption that happens within the borders of the EU, but the way that financial centres within the EU act as facilitators for that dirty money, up to $1 trillion per year that is leaving the developing world. And that's something that we need to address. Fortunately, there is a European Commission proposal also on the table now in the anti-money laundering rules that are being reformed, which would make it much, much more difficult for that corruption to take place. It would mean that the shell companies that are used to disguise that kind of corruption, those transactions, those shell companies would be known to the entire public. And I really hope that the European Parliament can make that a reality in the next couple of weeks.
Giovanni, I was in Brazil recently, just at the time of the elections, and many of my friends, lawyers there, were speaking about the change within Brazilian culture, that the prosecutions with Petrobras, with senior politicians at cabinet level being actually sent to prison, they acknowledge there's a deep level of corruption in the country, but it's getting better, and part of the reason is media exposure, prosecutors having greater confidence to act independently. And exactly the same was said to me last week by friends in Portugal as well. They were embarrassed by the former Prime Minister, but they were glad the system could operate this way. Can we see this advance in Europe? What do we need to do?
As it has happened in Italy, actually.
Yeah,
so
exactly
just to add another example. Yes, again, the big difference would be made if we can do it not just country by country in a kind of random way, but all over Europe. And in order to do it all over Europe, we need to establish European bodies dealing with it. And so to address the issues not just country by country, because the phenomenon itself is not purely national. And secondly, we need, let's say, at least harmonized rules. It's not possible that in some country, or in most of the country, corruption is a serious crime, and in other country it is not. Also because then those who want to do crimes or to do corruption, they go to this country and they do it there. So those who are opposing, still now, the European Commission proposals to harmonize at least the criminal law on corruption, on protection of financial interests, are opposing their own national interests, actually. We need more harmonization and a stronger role of the Europe in this.
Kati, you agree?
Well, I think I'm the more skeptical one on this issue at this table. I do think we need to harmonize, obviously. And it cannot be just from an economic point of view. We do have one big internal market. We need a level playing field. So that's one of the reasons why we fully support this justice scoreboard, which is coming. But then, what makes me a bit skeptical is saying that sometimes we are looking for European solutions when the problems are really also national. And I don't mean that we shouldn't work together, we shouldn't harmonize, but we should not forget to also address that there are still some weak anti-corruption national institutions. And we cannot just look away from that by saying, let's solve it by making a European watchdog. So I think that these two issues should always go hand in hand, and we cannot say we are solving one issue. If, for instance, if we have a problem in one member state, the solution is that we put something at the European level and institute to follow it up. So I think we should never forget also the national dimension.
Okay, just keep on this point for a moment, because when we're dealing with budgets, we have a clear scoreboard for budgets, and there are punishments to varying degrees for budget excesses, which France is now under scrutiny for as well. And we do it for other different sectors as well. Why can't we do this for accession criteria, for example, we have the chapters and we have to make sure that they reach certain criteria for those. Why can we not reapply this on an annual basis and say, you're doing okay, you're in recess with this, you need some action, and this is all about money at the end of the day primarily. So why does the European Commission not fine countries which do not take sufficient action at justice level? Giovanni?
The European Union is doing this. There are some member states which have entered into Europe
The
and
Council of Europe is not accepting to apply these rules.
Yes.
The Council of Europe, it's different. Commission gives the directions, but the member states do not accept them.
See, the Council, you mean?
Yes.
European Council.
Yes, European Council.
Yeah. Yeah, it is true. European Union as such is doing, and the Commission is doing so. But actually, the proposal of having something at a European level is not to dismiss the national dimension, is to integrate it. Think about investigations on corruption, which must be of a transnational nature because money moves. Today, you need still the system of the 19th century, actually, which is derogatory. So the international cooperation, which is old, we need.
But we can't even get this on parking fines. So the sharing of justice information was expired. And how are we going to get this for complex investigations?
The Apple would create for the first time, and it's much needed, Europe as one space of justice, where the same evidence that you find in a country is valid in the other countries, and where the prosecutors and the policemen in this investigation can move all over Europe freely. I mean, as if it were one country, which is already for those who do illicit gains or economy.
Eva, let's assume that we had a unified system like this. Would you trust another jurisdiction in another language with another political, another legal culture to process your action fairly and accurately and with a sense of justice?
Well, as they say, we don't trust politicians, right? So I would say that if we all agree, then we'll try to apply the rules. So it seems that the multinationals create the biggest problem on corruption. So this means it's not national, it's beyond nations. Because this is the biggest problem, I repeat. So the problem is that they are smarter and that you cannot punish them because they're smarter and they try to go around the regulation. So you have to be effective, you have to be quick, you have to see where the problem is created, and you have to handle it for the next time to help it to make the system more effective. So I think we cannot punish somebody because he's smart. We have to be smarter, more effective, to create a stronger EU and strengthen the regulations and the harmonization. It's a big discussion.
Kati, most people will say, police officers have spoken to about this as well, they would say police are always behind the criminal. Criminals always one step ahead, always more innovative, and they don't have to deal with bureaucracy. Is the corporate governance and shareholder responsibility perhaps one of the key drivers for resolving the corruption issue rather than dealing with the criminal system?
Well, I think I'm not saying we should exclude both systems. Really, the only thing I'm saying is that we shouldn't forget to look also at some still very weak national institutions. So that's really the point I'm trying to make here is, as you were saying just right now, when we have accession of new countries, we have very clear criteria. And the problem is actually that we never apply these criteria anymore after accession.
Yeah.
That's a problem as well.
Let me bring this to question, and Giovanni can answer this. This is from Facebook with Gary Jesperson, and she asks exactly this. Europe can't be held responsible for the level of corruption in member states, but we can limit the power of one member state in the council if there's too much corruption in this country, surely.
Well, another issue is to measure the corruption in a country. Okay, we measure the perception of the corruption in a country. But in many of the cases, we are dealing with corruption and fraud of Olaf. But in many of our investigations, you see that there are more countries involved, or entrepreneur of one country, a politician of the other country. And then where do you put, in which country you put the corruption? So it's a bit difficult to measure with a country-related view phenomena which are not only focused on a country.
Which are the most frequent occurrences of corruption that you come across in terms of investigation? We had John Daly, former commissioner, for example, and you deal with Swedish Match and Malta, and this complexity is exactly the kind of issue, and peddling of influence. Is this typical, or what are you dealing with?
No, we cannot say that this is typical. It has not been typical, fortunately. And it has been a failed attempt, actually, to the maximum consideration of this case. What we see more frequently, actually, nowadays, from our perspective of Olaf, are corruption related to public tenders. Actually, which happens many times, and where there are
not... Back to David's point that really
not
transparency solves this.
Exactly. Transparency and prevention. So good administration is even more important, actually. It's difficult to say which of the three dimensions is the most important. The prevention, good administration, good rules, transparency in the administrative procedure is paramount to prevent it. And then how to make it distasteful. The likelihood to be detected if you have in place good legal system and institutions like the European prosecutor, which has a good view of the phenomenon and can detect it more easily, and good controls in place, and then the likelihood of the punishment. So all these three dimensions.
And exposure, of course.
Pardon?
Exposure.
I was going to come to actually media exposure as well, and the confidence of independent media to act in part.
Yes, because I have to tell you, for an example, Siemens in Greece was one of the biggest scandals of corruption with politicians. It was solved in Greece. Okay, we had punishment, we had justice, but what happened in Germany? Was it exposed through the media? This is an issue that also doesn't recognize its borders.
This is the very last stage of the process, and actually it comes only in very few instances, the exposure, because it's the very, very last stage. I think we have to, it's like treating an illness, okay, or public health. You have to start with the prevention, and then the detection, and then the cure, and
Okay, let's bring in another of our students. Martin Soria from the University of Vigo in Spain. Martin, welcome. You have a question for our panel?
Good afternoon. My question as well is hot. Could it be a form or a way to kill corruption, replicate what Napoleon Bonaparte did with his minister, allowing them to steal a bit in exchange for managing and governing efficiently?
Okay, Carl, given that you're all about transparency, would you be happy for... Is it because this really happens in some countries, doesn't it? I'm not going to blacken the name of any in particular, but we know that some are perfectly fond of clientelism, and that there's a blind eye turned by senior administrators, allowing corporate officials to take what they like in exchange for a functioning of the economy and on their terms.
Yes, no, that absolutely does happen, and I agree with Giovanni that one of the main problems across Europe, not only with EU money, is the corruption in public tenders, the way that government contracts are allocated, and that can be individual...
What are the key issues? What's wrong with the way they're allocated?
Well, the issue is that they are often in very informal processes given to people who are donators to that political party, friends or cronies of the people in government, and you can see that very clearly in some countries, whereby you look at some companies, when one government is in power, they dominate the public procurement, public tender market, the government switches, and another set of companies suddenly dominate the public procurement market. Now, that's a form of state capture, and I think we should be very worried about.
Are there countries which don't do that?
Well, there are companies with better public administrations, much more transparency. I think Estonia is a very good example of a country which has really taken seriously these preventative measures. E-procurement is something, there's a procurement online is something which is done as a routine there. It's a very transparent system. But also, maybe more importantly, Estonia, a country which has risen several points in our ranking in Europe, is that the involvement of civil society in decision making. So, for example, civil society groups are involved very closely in the way that EU structural funds are planned and spent. And if you have that level of public watchdog on the way EU money is spent, not just a few police authorities, not just a few judicial authorities, that can be very effective in curbing corruption.
Eva, would you like to see money just stopped going to particular countries until they got their house in order and provided more transparent systems? Would that be sensible?
Well, we have transparency, but we also have problems with corruption. So this doesn't help it a lot, because we do, as I told you, we have a system. Nothing is legal until it's public on the internet. Yes. So the problem is how you get the money and where the money goes. So you have to have control on what really happens with the money. So if the decision is good, not if it's legal. So you have to change the whole mentality of where the public money is spent, And this is very difficult because you have to change the mentality of people and what they expect from the politicians, because politicians could be greedy if you give them something or try to get more, so they wouldn't stop. So I don't think this would only open a door that we couldn't close. So I can remind you that some cases in Turkey, for example, when you had strong accusations of corruption, people re-elected the same politicians. So what does this mean? That conspiracy theories and media play a huge role. So we have to start by self-controlling, and not only ourselves but our political parties. So this is a huge issue. So I think Finland has a very good system of transparency at the political party. This could help, and we could have more democratic parties. So this means that politicians, if somebody wants to be a candidate, he has to go through the political party. Yes, I agree that through the nations we can give many solutions, but if we want a stronger EU, we have to apply the same rules or have the harmonization between all those rules applied.
Okay. Kati, do you think that lobbyists corrupt the process, and what could we do to improve that?
To me, not. I mean, I don't. To me, anyone can lobby, but that doesn't make me naturally a corrupt politician. In the end, it's the corrupt politician's responsibility how to react to that. But it's good to have transparency there. Who am I meeting? Am I also meeting civil society? What is the result of the people I'm meeting, and then my vote? I think it's very good that we have at the European level organizations who are very strongly following that. And having worked before this and advising political parties outside of the European Union on, especially on these issues we discuss now, on how to become more transparent, how to become more democratic, I think it's crucial that the funding political parties get, it's very clear where it comes from. Then you also see who they're accountable for.
Okay.
Are they accountable to their voters, or are they accountable to the ones paying them?
Okay, Giovanni, inside the institutions themselves, the whistleblower status, is this something which is at a sufficiently mature level, given the consequence of Kosovo that we've seen recently, where the whistleblower wasn't protected?
Well, inside the European institutions, the whistleblowers are protected by the EU staff regulations, and so they are protected by possible negative repercussions on their career for having done whistleblowing. This is law, and it is implemented. And actually, we have whistleblowers within the European institutions which report to us. As far as we can, we do not report on their identity, which is an additional layer of protection, but this cannot be done every time, of course, because there is a fundamental right of the person accused to know the identity of the witnesses. But I think this system is relatively well working within the European institution, for sure, better than at the national level. And this is part of the strategy to combat corruption. But also I want to attract the attention of a very recent decision of the European Commission on the issue of transparency with the meeting of lobbyists done by commissioners and director general, which has already been decided, and it is implemented in order to add additional transparency on the European Commission decisions.
So we've got to finish. Work in progress. Thank you all for your contribution today. Really, what we looked at is issues to do with perception, transparency, trust in democracy, which is bound up entirely with our perception of politicians. The capacity to stop the robber barons. How do we control our corporations today and the influence that they wield also? Prevention, detection, reaction. Each of these aspects bound up together as well. And the positions that the Parliament, the Commission, Council have not taken in the past, we may see in the next 5 years implemented. And with greater transparency, transnational actions, police forces, public prosecutor for Europe, making corruption distasteful, and the prosecution itself having a more serious consequence. No more parking fines, but prison sentences where those crimes are prevalent as well. Good administration and the protection of whistleblowers. A very tough pattern to draw together. But thank you to Kati PIRI, Giovanni Kessler, Carl Dolan, Eva Kelly, Georgios KATROUGKALOS, and our students Martin Soria, Clara Soteris, and Roger Torres as well. I'm Brian Maguire. Thank you for joining us today.